It was the autumn of 1977, and the morning was cold for East Texas, the kind of cold that settles into fence posts and old barnwood and doesn't let go until noon. Trucks rolled down the gravel road before sunrise, kicking up dust that hung in the air like smoke. Men in pressed jackets stepped out of cars that didn't belong to this county. They carried clipboards. They carried maps of the land, folded into neat squares. Neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, hats in hand, saying nothing. They had come the way people come to a funeral. Because in a sense, that's exactly what this was. The Whitfield family stood near their porch, watching strangers measure the value of everything they had ever loved. 3 generations had been raised on this soil. Now it would be sold to the highest bidder before the sun reached its peak. Then, just as the auctioneer began setting up his stand, something happened that nobody in that crowd expected. A girl walked up the road alone. She could not have been older than 14. She wore a plain coat, scuffed boots, and she carried herself like she belonged there, though no one could say why. A few investors glanced at her and smiled the way adults smile at children who have wandered somewhere they shouldn't be. They had no idea that before the day ended, this quiet girl would force every wealthy man on that property into a battle none of them saw coming. What happened next would become one of the most talked about mornings in that part of Texas for decades to come. If stories about kindness, perseverance, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things still matter to you, consider subscribing to MJ Farm Stories. And before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know which corner of the world you're joining us from today. The Whitfield land had been worked since 1931, when Otho Whitfield's father cleared the first acres with a mule and a borrowed plow. Back then, owning land wasn't about wealth, it was about survival and about leaving something behind that outlasted you. Otho grew up learning the rhythm of the seasons before he learned to read. His mother taught him which clouds meant rain and which meant nothing at all. His father taught him that a handshake was worth more than any signed paper, because a man's word was the only currency that never lost its value. By the time Otho had children of his own, the farm had become something more than property. It was a living record of every winter survived, every harvest celebrated, every lesson passed quietly from one generation to the next. Family farms like this one were the backbone of rural America. They taught patience, they taught responsibility, they taught children that food did not simply appear, it was earned through calloused hands and long days. For the Whitfields, this farm was never just dirt and fences, it was memory itself. By the mid-1970s, farming had become a different kind of battle, one fought with numbers instead of weather. Interest rates climbed higher than most families could absorb. Equipment costs doubled in a matter of years. A string of dry seasons cut harvests thin, and grain prices refused to cooperate. Otho borrowed against the land to keep the farm running, the way many of his neighbors did. It seemed reasonable at the time. Everyone assumed prices would recover. They didn't. Debt piled on top of debt. The bank, patient at first, eventually ran out of patience. Letters arrived, then warnings, then, finally, a notice that no farming family ever wants to read. This wasn't a story about carelessness. It was a story repeated across thousands of farms during one of the hardest agricultural decades in American history. Good people, doing everything right, caught in forces far larger than themselves. The bank scheduled the auction for a Saturday, in late autumn. Word spread through the county fast. Nobody in that crowd recognized the girl walking toward the gathering. She moved slowly, taking in the barn, the fences, the worn porch steps, like she was reading a story only she understood. She didn't smile. She didn't fidget. She simply watched with the kind of stillness most 14-year-olds haven't learned yet. A few people whispered, "Whose child is that? Did someone bring her? Why isn't she standing with a parent?" She showed no fear standing among grown men twice her age, men far more accustomed to being in charge of a room. If anything, she looked more at ease than most of them. Nobody asked her name yet. Nobody guessed that she had any reason to be there at all. Years earlier, when a brutal ice storm swept through the county, a young rancher named Garth Whitfield, Otho's son, had spent 3 sleepless nights helping a struggling neighbor save a herd of cattle from freezing in an unprotected pasture. That neighbor's name was Calloway, and the cattle belonged to a widow raising 2 children alone after losing her husband to a tractor accident the spring before. Garth never asked for payment. He simply showed up night after night with blankets and feed and a lantern until the herd was safe. The widow's youngest daughter, a quiet girl named Tansy Calloway, never forgot it. Her grandfather, a careful and old-fashioned man named Eldridge Calloway, often told her, "Money should protect what matters most." He spent years teaching her about saving, about responsibility, about honoring debts that aren't written on paper. Tansy had learned those lessons well. She just hadn't been given a reason to use them until now. By mid-morning, the yard was full. Investors studied survey maps. A few compared notes on soil quality and resale value. Neighbors stood quietly near the fence line, the way people stand when they want to support a family without intruding on their grief. Tansy stepped closer to the crowd. A couple of men chuckled, assuming she had simply tagged along with someone. One investor even offered her a peppermint, the way adults do when they want children to stay out of the way. She accepted it politely and said nothing else. Minutes later, a quiet woman and a man carrying a worn leather case slipped through the crowd and came to stand near her. Almost no one noticed. Fewer still thought anything of it. The auctioneer started with tools, plows, a tractor, a hay baler that had outlived 3 decades of harvests. Lucinda Whitfield, Otho's wife, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth as each item sold for less than it was worth. Then came the land itself. Bids rose quickly among the investors. Numbers climbed past what most locals believed the property was worth, each man trying to outlast the others. Then, in a pause between bids, a small hand rose into the air. The auctioneer blinked. "Young lady, do you understand what you're bidding on?" Tansy nodded once. "Yes, sir." The crowd went silent enough to hear the wind moving through the fence wire. What the crowd didn't know was that Tansy wasn't bidding alone. Her grandfather had passed away 2 winters earlier, leaving behind a modest trust meant for her education and future. Before he died, he had arranged for her mother and a small-town attorney named Foster Pruitt to act on her behalf in exactly this kind of situation. Tansy raised her hand because she understood the value of the moment. The actual offers, the legal authority, the paperwork, all of it moved through her mother and Mr. Pruitt, standing just behind her. She wasn't a 14-year-old acting recklessly. She was a 14-year-old who had been raised to recognize an opportunity to repay a debt that mattered more to her than money ever could. The bidding narrowed to 2 parties, a confident investor named Roy Cutter and the modest offer rising steadily from the Calloway family's side. Cutter increased his bid. Pruitt matched it. Cutter raised again. Pruitt matched it again, calmly, without hesitation. The crowd grew tense. Cutter glanced at Tansy, expecting her to back down. She didn't blink. One final number was placed. Silence stretched long enough that the auctioneer had to repeat it. Cutter shook his head and stepped back. "Sold," the auctioneer said, "to the Calloway family." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but the surprise wasn't finished. Tansy walked toward the Whitfields, her mother and Mr. Pruitt beside her, and explained quietly that she had no intention of taking their home. The land would be leased back to the Whitfields under fair, affordable terms, giving them years to rebuild without the weight of impossible debt. Lucinda Whitfield wept. Otho, a man who had not cried in front of others since his own father's funeral, lowered his head and thanked a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. Word of what happened that morning spread through the county within days. Neighbors who had once felt powerless to help one another began organizing small funds to support struggling families during hard seasons. People began to understand that wealth, without compassion, accomplishes very little, while even a small act of loyalty can ripple outward for years. Decades later, longtime residents still mention that morning when they talk about what makes their community different from anywhere else. Land can feed a family for a season. Kindness feeds generations. The greatest investments are rarely measured in dollars. Sometimes it takes the smallest person in the room to remind everyone else what truly matters, because in the end, success isn't about what we own. It's about what we choose to protect.